why is it that we as human beings are always seeking out war, in some countries more than others? So I have with me Norm Solomon, and his book, War Made Invisible, has been published by the New Press. It's a searing expose of how the American military, with the help of the media, conceals its perpetual wars. Now, Norman Solomon is the co-founder of Roots Action. Please go look them up and support this organization. And he is the executive director of the Institute for Public Accuracy. He is an author, an activist, and a humanitarian. Now, I've had the pleasure of working with Norman on many, many projects. He is a pusher of peace on a mission for justice. Norman, it's such a pleasure to have you here with us on Unbossed to talk about your new book.
Oh, I'm so glad to talk with you and the entire Unbossed audience.
Yeah, we appreciate that. And so we want to put up a cover of your book. We want our viewers to see the book right here. This is it. War Made Invisible: How America Hides the Human Toll of Its Military Machine. And Norman, I started reading the book, and I am a quote. I just love quotes so much. And there are three very deep quotes at the beginning of your book, one of which really struck me, and it reads rather, the propagandist's purpose is to make one set of people forget that certain other sets of people are human. Oh my God. And that's Hughley, 1936. Norman, tell us a little bit about why that quote. There are two by Hughley, and there's another one by someone else. All of them were absolutely riveting, but that one stuck out for me the most. And then I have another one that I'm sure you're familiar with from the great 20th century unionist Asa Philip Randolph. But why this quote, why those three quotes in particular, and talk to us about how they set up the foundational premises of your book.
Well, that quote really blew me away when I read it, and I thought, I gotta start the book this way, because it really is the way in which, whether we talk about across town or across the country or around the world, the injustice gets reinforced. And this objectification of other people. Oh, you're not like us. You don't matter as much. Sometimes it's subtle, sometimes it's overt. But as Martin Luther King said, the spending on military is what he called, and I'm quoting here, a demonic suction tube that takes away resources from healthcare, education, housing, elderly care, children care, so much other. And really, I think it's an example of how when we don't take all of humanity seriously, what goes around comes around. Because if you have a country, as unfortunately we do, based on injustice, then a lot of the same attitudes and power structure inferences and leverage is replicated in foreign policy. And I think that's where we have this disconnect between social movements in the United States that are really fighting the power, that are really fighting for people, avoiding foreign policy when really we're all one humanity. We got 7 or 8 billion people on this planet. What goes around comes around, whether it's climate emergency, whether it's COVID, whether it's overall health of people on the planet.
That's exactly right. And I think our country, more than any other, because of our hegemonic positioning, and we also know what goes up must come down. I mean, we might not always be in a hegemonic position, but we are right now. But certainly when you are in a hegemonic position, it causes a bit of arrogance. And sometimes that arrogance can blur a lot of lines and cause us to act collectively. When I say us, I'm saying as a nation collectively in ways that if we did not have a hegemonic positioning in the world, we would not necessarily act. And sometimes forget some basic premises, some basic principles, such as when Dr. King said, what happens to one directly happens to us all indirectly, or that we all are intertwined. And certainly if nothing reminded us of that, this COVID-19, the pandemic should have seared that in our minds, that we are connected in every single way. And it is just a matter of time for chaos or goodness to come at our door. If it's at somebody else's door, it's not a lifetime away. It will absolutely happen. So the other quote that I think is foundational, even though you didn't use this in your book, is Asa Philip Randolph, one of the greatest 20th century unionists and civil rights leaders. And this, we know that war making is really all about the money. Make wars unprofitable and you make them impossible. Again, that's Asa Philip Randolph. He led the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. He was very instrumental in pushing FDR to desegregate the military. He threatened to march on Washington in the 1940s, just all around good freedom fighter. But Norma, that's really what this is coming down to in so many ways, is gluttony and greed. And the war-making machine is in full control, as we see. So now, can you speak to, more than 20 years ago, and 9/11 and the war in Afghanistan set into motion a hugely consequential shift in American foreign policy, a perpetual state of war. And this is what you write about in your book. Can you speak to 9/11 and the war in Afghanistan being, why were those two things, or why did those two things present such a consequential shift, as you put it?
The terrible crime of 9/11, killing 3,000 people, in the media spin and the politics of Washington, gave a sort of a preemptive absolution to anything the United States would do. And that worked politically, it worked in the media, it worked psychologically, that the United States really, for the first time in memory, perhaps since the Civil War, had suffered this terrible, fairly large scale killing on 9/11. And so the United States, which, to put it rather crudely, is accustomed to dishing it out, but not taking it with murderous actions around the world, that was a blank check. And another way to put it, it was a political license to kill. And so weeks after 9/11, the United States attacked Afghanistan. And when you look at the numbers, and this is predictable, I quoted people in the book who said it at the time, the US would end up slaughtering vastly more numbers of people than had occurred on 9/11. And this is sort of an attitude that, for every one of us, we're gonna kill 100 of you, which is really not far off from the ratio of what took place. The Cost of War Project at Brown University documents close to 1 million people directly killed by the US so-called war on terror. And that doesn't account for every one of those, several others indirectly: water supplies, healthcare, infrastructure, decimating several countries, Afghanistan included, Iraq, Libya. These are crimes against humanity. And the United States is not the only government to do that, but it certainly is one of the main ones, if not the main one, in the 21st century. So it's, long story short, we've got to fess up. The scholar Edward Said on the Middle East said, at the very least, we need remorse.
Yeah.
We don't have remorse right now, and we better get it on the table so we can turn this around.
That's right, because what goes around comes around. And to that point, now, how has the United States gotten away with hiding the human toll of its military machine?
Power, silence, arrogance, hubris, the leverage of the propaganda levers of power, major media, and the dehumanization of others. One of the main themes of the book, and really an impetus for me to write it, was I felt hidden in plain sight was this attitude that there are two tiers of grief, ours and theirs. Ours, which really is, of course, humanly valid. Look what happened at 9/11. Look at what happened, several thousand American troops dying in Iraq, the grieving families, the loved ones. That's part of humanity. We all have suffered it to some extent. As time goes on, we lose a loved one. That is what is part of what makes us human. So that's the tier of grief that is validated and affirmed. But there's another tier of grief. Yeah. People at the other end of US missiles and bombs. And tacitly or explicitly, through the silence and through the short shrift of coverage, the message from media and politics, I'm talking NBC, CBS, NPR, and also I'm talking Capitol Hill and the White House. That tier of grief, no big deal, doesn't matter, virtual non-persons.
Yeah, and once you start to dehumanize people, that's it right there. We really have lost all hope. Why is that you think the American people, so you talked about the media and that you explore a lot, that component of it, that the media is complicit, in allowing this country get away with it, or not telling the American people the absolute truth about the toll of war or perpetual wars that are happening all over the country. Is that part of the American psyche now, Norman, at this point? We as a nation, the whole notion of manifest destiny, to your point, God has chosen us. So obviously God didn't choose anybody else. It's all about us. And if we step in, we have God on our side. Everybody, every world leader, when they're, especially when they're war making, they believe that God is on their side. Is there something about that mentality, particularly in the American psyche, that may cause the American people to really have a callous indifference towards the suffering of other people and other people's children, other people's communities?
I think it's especially prevalent among white Americans. And the history of the United States, based on white supremacy, still many, many manifestations of it, leads us to this arrogance that somehow the United States is the light unto the world. I quote, and unfortunately we have women and people of color in leadership positions sometimes who have taken up this attitude as well. I, in the book, quote Lyndon Johnson, and he says to Vietnam troops, "You are compassionate. You're doing compassionate work here in the war in Vietnam." And then you fast forward, and almost in the same kind of speech, Barack Obama says that to the troops in Afghanistan. "You're here to help people. You are compassionate."
Yeah. And we destroyed these people's countries that still have not been rebuilt in a way that we would find acceptable as a nation. And but by the grace of God, there go us. We could be Iraq, like the roles could definitely be reversed. And I don't think a lot of times we think about that. And this country, we continue to feed the military machine, and Americans are psyched out thinking that the more we spend, the safer we are. But on the other side of the ledger, Norman, we neglect domestic issues, as you were naming in a certain part of the earlier part of a question that you answered. I want to share this graphic with our viewers just to remind them. I've shared this many, many times on this show, but the United States spends more on defense than the next 10 countries combined. And put Norman up, and let's keep the graph up, please. And as we can see, most of the nations, though, in that list are allies of ours in some form or fashion, yet we spend more money than all of these nations combined. And it seems, Norman, that in DC these days, and maybe days in the past as well, the major thing that the two political duopolies can agree on is continuing to enrich the military industrial complex. Can you share with the viewers why they should care about what is done in our name, number one, and number two, how those resources could be better deployed domestically and for peacemaking all across the world? And that in and of itself would help us to be a safer nation and a safer world.
As you said, what goes around comes around. Saying to people in the rest of the world, do as we say, not as we do. In the long run, that's not going to wash too well. When we have a majority of close to 60% of the federal discretionary budget going to war and preparation for war in the Pentagon, then there's not much left, and we're left fighting over scraps. And whereas with domestic policy, not as big a difference as I wish there was between the Democratic and Republican parties, but a real difference on many, many issues between Democrats and Republicans on Capitol Hill on domestic issues. And yet, as you say, when you get beyond, as the saying goes, beyond the water's edge, foreign policy, militarism, they're in lockstep. And Biden says he's thrilled to sign one exorbitant military budget after another. And when these expenditures are literally taking food out of the mouths of children, we have a moral crisis, a spiritual, as Dr. King said, approaching spiritual death. And frankly, sometimes I'm afraid we've gotten there.
Oh no, we're there. I mean, this is the world that Dr. King and so many others in different ways warned us about, and we're there. And if we don't capture ourselves, if we don't have a reckoning and a recognition, as you said earlier about this, it's only gonna get worse. In my closing question, I wanna bring in Daniel Ellsberg. I know, we both know he recently died on June 16th. He is best known for leaking the Pentagon Papers and exposing the United States' role and lies to the American people about the Vietnam War. He is, however, known in the peace movement circles as an opponent of forever wars and a crusader for peace. Talk to us about your relationship with him, how he influenced you. And I know that you wrote a piece in Common Dreams about him, but he certainly was a great man, a bright light, and his spirit continues to live on.
For me and so many people who were able to get to know him and work with him, it was just so elevating. I feel now Daniel Ellsberg Presente still with us. And he had a generosity of spirit that I think came out of his remorse. He was part of the war machine. He had the Pentagon Papers, unlike everybody else. He shared it with the world. So for 52 years, the last 52 of his life, he was into affirming life, protecting and challenging the warfare state. And for me, I still feel he's with me, he's with us. And we need each other to elevate the possibilities of the future.
Yeah, we do. The possibilities of a future, a possibility of peace. And he did say about the Vietnam War, quote, "It wasn't that we were on the wrong side, we were the wrong side." And it's so good that he had an epiphany and that he, in the last 52 years of his life, he used all that he knew to really be a crusader for peace. Oh my God, Norman Solomon, it was so great to have you here on the show. Let's put Norman's book back up. War Made Invisible, How America Hides the Human Toll of Its Military Machine. And Norman, how can folks find you on social media and how can they find this book?
The book's online now, the usual sellers. And I'm glad to hear from everybody. I have a website at normansolomon.com and you can email me straight from there.
Oh, thank you, Norman. Thank you for all the great work that you continue to do in this atmosphere. We really appreciate you being a crusader for peace as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much.